She called my MBA, just paper right there in front of the entire executive committee at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday that felt like a public execution without the dignity of last words. I was presenting the quarterly risk assessment framework I'd spent 3 months perfecting when Vivian Cross, our chief operating officer, leaned back in her leather chair like she owned the oxygen in the room and said with that smile that could freeze hellfire, "Well, this is all very theoretical, but we need practical solutions, not academic exercises from someone whose only real-world experience is just paper credentials." The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the sound of my professional reputation bleeding out onto the mahogany conference table. I'd been at Meridian Financial for 8 months as senior risk analyst, a position that required exactly the kind of strategic thinking and analytical framework they were now dismissing as academic fluff. Vivian had a bachelor's degree from a state school circa 1987. And 20 years of climbing the corporate ladder through what she liked to call street smarts, which apparently meant stepping on anyone who threatened her with actual knowledge. She'd been gunning for me since day one, not because I was incompetent, but because I represented everything she wasn't: educated, credentialed, and worst of all, young enough to outlast her reign of mediocrity. The presentation I was giving wasn't theoretical. It was a comprehensive analysis of the company's exposure to market volatility with specific recommendations for portfolio, rebalancing, and risk mitigation strategies. I'd used Monte Carlo simulations, behavioral economics models, and predictive analytics to identify patterns that their current system missed entirely. But Vivian didn't want solutions. She wanted to remind everyone in that room that despite my graduate degree from Wharton, despite my summa cum laude honors, despite my thesis on systemic risk in emerging markets, I was still just the new kid who needed to learn her place. The other executives nodded along like bobbleheads in a hurricane, afraid to contradict the woman who controlled budget approvals and performance reviews, Thomas Wright, the CFO who'd actually read my report and called it brilliant in an email. The week before suddenly found his coffee cup fascinating. Janet Torres from Compliance, who'd been asking me for copies of my risk models to implement in her department, stared at her laptop screen like it contained the secrets of the universe. Even Raymond Kim, the CEO who'd personally recruited me from Goldman Sachs, managed nothing more than a diplomatic throat clearing before moving to the next agenda item. I sat down feeling like I'd been professionally waterboarded, with a smile and a handshake after the meeting as everyone filed out, making that awkward small talk people make when they've just witnessed a corporate assassination. Vivian lingered. She approached my chair where I was still sitting, paralyzed by humiliation and rage, and leaned down close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive that couldn't quite mask the stench of insecurity. "Don't take it personally, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "But around here, we value experience over education. You'll learn that eventually if you last long enough. The if hung in the air like a threat." I nodded. Because what else do you do when someone with executive authority just told you your degree, your knowledge, your entire professional identity was worthless? I gathered my presentation materials, walked back to my cubicle, and sat there staring at my computer screen until the words blurred together like abstract art made of spreadsheets and suppressed fury. Hey, if you're enjoying this corporate bloodbath and thinking, "Damn, I've been there too," then smash that subscribe button, because we're about to turn this academic paper into a masterclass in professional revenge, and I'm aiming for 1,000 subscribers who know the difference between real intelligence and corporate bullying. So help me get there while we watch Vivian learn what happens when you underestimate someone with actual credentials. That night, I went home to my studio apartment, opened a bottle of wine that cost more than Vivian probably spent on lunch, and did what any rational person would do. In my situation, I started planning her professional obituary, not literally, obviously, but I began to map out exactly how someone with just paper credentials could systematically dismantle the career of someone who valued street smarts over strategic thinking. The first thing I did was audit my own position, not emotionally, but analytically. What were my actual responsibilities? What authority did I technically have? What access had they given me without really thinking about the implications turned out quite a lot. As senior risk analyst, I had read access to virtually every financial database the company used. I could pull trading records, compliance reports, audit findings, client portfolios, regulatory filings, and market position data. More importantly, I had right access to the risk assessment dashboard that fed directly into the monthly board reports, the same reports that determined executive bonuses, performance ratings, and strategic direction. The same reports that Vivian had to present to the board as Kivu without really understanding the underlying analysis because she'd never bothered to learn the technical aspects of modern risk management. She just trusted that the smart kids in the back room would make her look competent, which up until now they had. The second thing I did was research Vivian's background, not just the official bio on the company website, but the real story. Her LinkedIn showed the standard corporate climbing trajectory, but with some interesting gaps. A 2-year period at her previous company where her title didn't change, suggesting a plateau, a brief stint at a consulting firm that lasted less than 18 months, which screamed failure in consulting terms. And most interesting, a pattern of moving companies every 3 to 4 years, right around the time most organizations would be expecting senior executives to demonstrate measurable long-term value creation. Then I dug deeper into her actual contributions at Meridian. What initiatives had she led? What measurable improvements could be attributed to her leadership? What strategic decisions bore her fingerprints? The answer was surprisingly little. Vivian was what business schools call a maintenance manager, someone who keeps existing systems running without innovation or improvement. She'd inherited a smoothly functioning operations department, and her primary achievement was not breaking it. Her signature projects were cost-cutting measures that looked good on quarterly reports, but created long-term operational vulnerabilities. The kind of short-sighted decision-making that risk analysts are specifically hired to identify and prevent. By Friday, I had a clear picture. Vivian Cross was a corporate survivor, not a leader. Someone who'd built her career on taking credit for other people's work, avoiding responsibility for failures, and eliminating threats to her position through politics rather than performance. She wasn't incompetent exactly. She was strategically mediocre, and she'd made the mistake of thinking my credentials made me weak, when actually they made me dangerous because, unlike her, I knew how to build a case. That's when I started my real education. Not the kind you get from textbooks, but the kind you get from understanding exactly how corporate power structures work and how to exploit them. I spent the weekend creating what I called Operation Paper Trail, a systematic documentation of every financial decision Vivian had made over the past 2 years, every recommendation she'd approved, every risk assessment she'd signed off on without understanding the underlying mathematics. I pulled trading records, cross-referenced them with market conditions, and built a comprehensive picture of her decision-making patterns. What I found was even better than I'd hoped. Vivian's risk management decisions had a consistent pattern of being 6 months behind market trends. She approved hedging strategies after volatility spikes, recommended portfolio adjustments after sector rotations, and signed off on exposure limits that ignored correlation changes. Her street smarts had led her to make decisions based on what had already happened rather than what statistical models predicted would happen next. The beautiful part was that most of these decisions had worked out okay, not because they were smart, but because markets had been relatively stable. But I could model scenarios where her approach would have cost the company significant money, And more importantly, I could demonstrate how proper quantitative analysis would have generated better outcomes with measurable risk reduction. I built spreadsheets showing alternative scenarios, ran Monte Carlo simulations on her historical decisions, and created visualizations that even a board member could understand, showing the gap between her intuitive approach and evidence-based risk management. The breakthrough came the following Monday during the weekly operations review. Vivian was presenting her usual collection of charts and graphs showing departmental efficiency metrics when Raymond Kim asked a seemingly innocent question about our exposure to interest rate fluctuations in the current portfolio. Vivian gave one of those confident non-answers that executives use when they don't actually understand the question. She talked about diversification strategies and market positioning, using buzzwords like optimization and systematic approaches. But she didn't provide any actual numbers, any specific risk calculations, or any concrete mitigation strategies, because she couldn't. She literally didn't know how Raymond looked confused. Which was fair because Vivian's answer had been the verbal equivalent of elevator music. Pleasant sounding, but ultimately meaningless. That's when I did something that in retrospect was either brilliant or career suicide. I raised my hand. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "I can actually provide those specific risk calculations if it would be helpful." The room turned to look at me. Vivian's smile could have cut glass, but Raymond nodded. "Please do." I opened my laptop and pulled up the analysis. I've been working on a comprehensive breakdown of interest rate sensitivity across our entire portfolio with stress testing scenarios and specific hedge recommendations. I didn't just give him numbers, I gave him actionable intelligence. Our current portfolio has a duration risk of approximately 4.7 years. I said, which means a 1% increase in interest rates would decrease portfolio value by roughly 4.7% based on current holdings that represents approximately $47 million in potential losses. Our current hedging strategy covers only about 60% of this exposure, leaving us with an unhedged risk of approximately $19 million. The room was silent. Vivian's face had gone through several color changes, settling on a shade that reminded me of old concrete. Raymond leaned forward. "Those are very specific numbers," he said. "Do you have recommendations?" I did. Of course, I had an entire presentation ready, complete with implementation timelines, cost, benefit, analysis, and risk, adjusted return projections. I walked through it systematically, professionally, demonstrating exactly the kind of practical application of theoretical knowledge that Vivian claimed didn't exist. When I finished, Raymond looked at Vivian, then back at me. "Why wasn't this included in the operations review?" he asked. Vivian's mouth opened and closed like a fish experiencing existential crisis. "Well," she stammered, "these are very preliminary numbers. We'd need to verify the methodology." "And I've been working on this analysis for 6 weeks," I interrupted politely. "It's based on real-time data from our trading systems and uses industry standard risk measurement protocols. I can provide the complete methodology and supporting documentation if you'd like." Raymond nodded slowly. "I think that would be very valuable. Can you have that ready for the board meeting next week?" Vivian looked like she'd been struck by lightning disguised as a compliment. "Of course," I said, maintaining eye contact with her. "I'll make sure you have everything you need to present it effectively that night." Vivian sent me an email marked urgent subject line, risk analysis, presentation review. The message was corporate speak translated into barely concealed panic. She wanted to schedule a meeting to go over my analysis to ensure alignment with departmental objectives and to coordinate messaging for executive stakeholders translation. "Help me understand what the hell you just did, so I don't look like an idiot in front of the board." I replied within minutes, suggesting we meet first thing Tuesday morning and offering to walk her through the entire framework, the analysis methodology, and the implementation strategy. I was helpful, professional, and cooperative in that email, the same tone you'd use to offer directions to someone who's clearly lost, but too proud to admit it. Tuesday morning arrived with all the subtle tension of a bomb disposal unit. Coffee break. Vivian was already in the conference room when I arrived, surrounded by printouts of my analysis like she was preparing for academic warfare, which in a way she was. She'd clearly spent the weekend trying to understand risk mathematics, the way someone might try to learn Mandarin from fortune cookies. Lots of effort, minimal comprehension. Let's start with the basics, she said, attempting to project authority while simultaneously asking for a tutorial. Can you explain how you calculated the duration risk? I opened my laptop and began what turned out to be a 3-hour masterclass in quantitative risk analysis. I walked her through portfolio theory, duration calculations, hedging strategies, and stress testing methodologies. I explained the mathematical foundations, showed her. The data sources demonstrated the software tools and provided context for every assumption and parameter in the model. Vivian took notes, frantically asking questions that revealed exactly how much she didn't know about the field. She was supposed to be overseeing. It wasn't malicious ignorance. It was structural. She'd been promoted based on operational management skills, but was now responsible for areas requiring technical expertise she didn't possess. And rather than admitting this gap and seeking education, she'd chosen to dismiss the expertise of others as impractical. By noon, she looked exhausted the way people do when they realize they've been in over their head for longer than they want to admit. This is incredibly comprehensive, she said finally, and I can see the value. But how do we present this to the board in a way that highlights operational efficiency rather than just academic theory? I smiled the same way a chess player smiles when their opponent finally sees the checkmate that's been inevitable for the last 6 moves. We don't present it as academic theory, I said. We present it as exactly what it is. Practical risk management that will save the company potentially tens of millions of dollars. We focus on the business impact, the measurable value creation, and the competitive advantage of having sophisticated risk analytics capabilities. What we don't do is pretend this is some kind of operational optimization when it's actually quantitative. Analysis requiring specific technical knowledge. Her pen stopped moving. You're saying the board needs to understand that this requires specialized expertise. Exactly, I said, maintaining that helpful tone that was beginning to feel like a weapon. And since you're presenting it, you'll want to be prepared to answer technical questions about methodology, confidence, intervals, and scenario assumptions. They'll expect the QU to have command of these details. Vivian's face went through the same color progression I'd seen in the previous week's meeting. Ending in that familiar concrete gray, Vivian Cross had just realized she was about to stand in front of the board of directors and try to explain mathematics. She couldn't understand methodology she couldn't replicate, and risk management strategies she couldn't defend. And she was going to have to do it while pretending these insights were the result of her operational leadership rather than my academic credentials. The meeting ended with Vivian thanking me for the preparation and asking me to be available during the board presentation. In case there were technical questions that needed clarification, I agreed. Of course. Offering to sit in the back of the room, ready to provide support if needed, the board meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. in the executive conference room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the table that cost more than most people's cars. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday preparing not just my technical materials, but my psychological strategy. This wasn't just about demonstrating competence. It was about timing revelation for maximum impact. I practiced my responses to potential questions rehearsed, explanations of complex concepts in accessible language, and most importantly, prepared follow-up analyses that would make it impossible for Vivian to claim credit for insights she couldn't replicate. I even prepared what I privately called the nuclear option, a detailed analysis of how Vivian's historical risk management decisions had deviated from quantitative best practices and what those deviations had cost the company. In opportunity costs and suboptimal returns, it was professional, thorough, and devastating. Basically everything. Her street smarts approach wasn't. Wednesday night, I got an email from Vivian's subject. Line additional coordination needed message. Was 3 paragraphs of corporate anxiety disguised as collaboration. She wanted to meet at 8 a.m. Thursday morning before the board presentation to ensure our messaging was perfectly aligned, to review any potential areas of confusion, and to make sure we were presenting a unified front translation. She wanted one last desperate attempt to understand enough of my analysis to avoid complete humiliation. I replied agreeing to the meeting, but suggesting we focus on the key business impact metrics, since those would be most relevant to board members who might not need deep technical detail. It was a polite way of saying I wasn't going to teach her graduate-level statistics in 30 minutes. Thursday morning, she was waiting in the conference room with 3 cups of coffee and the look of someone who'd been awake since 4 a.m., cramming for a final exam in astrophysics. I walked her through the executive summary, the key findings, and the recommended actions. But every question she asked revealed she still didn't grasp the mathematical foundations. When she asked how confident we could be in the projections, I explained confidence. Intervals, statistical significance, and margin of error. When she asked about implementation timeline, I outlined the technical requirements, system integration needs, and staff training considerations by 9:45. She looked like someone who'd just realized they'd volunteered to perform surgery after watching a medical drama. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing my best suit and carrying a leather portfolio that contained backup analyses, additional scenarios, and enough technical documentation to bury any question they might ask. Vivian was already there, looking like someone who'd spent the week studying for an exam in a language she didn't speak. She had her notes organized, her slides prepared, and that slightly manic smile people wear when they're about to perform a high-wire act. Without a net. Raymond Kim introduced the agenda item as a strategic risk assessment. Presentation by the operations team. Vivian stood up, clicked to her first slide, and began what would later be remembered as one of the most educational disasters in Meridian Financial's corporate history. She started confidently enough, reading directly from her prepared remarks about the importance of risk management and the need for sophisticated analytical frameworks. But the first question came from board member Patricia Wells, who asked about the specific correlation assumptions in the portfolio. Analysis. Vivian blinked, looked down at her notes, and gave an answer that was technically English but financially meaningless. She talked about correlation, diversification, and risk optimization without actually addressing the question about correlation coefficients between asset classes. Patricia looked confused, which was reasonable because Vivian's answer had been the equivalent of responding to a question about engine specifications by discussing the importance of transportation. The second question came from David Chen, who wanted to know about the confidence intervals in the stress testing scenarios. Vivian attempted to explain statistical confidence, the way someone might try to explain quantum physics using interpretive dance. She used phrases like robust methodology and comprehensive analysis while completely avoiding any actual numbers or mathematical concepts. David's follow-up question about Monte Carlo simulations sent Vivian into full corporate speak overdrive. She discussed simulation frameworks, analytical rigor, and quantitative approaches for 3 minutes without once mentioning probability. Distributions, random sampling, or convergence criteria, which are literally the foundation of Monte Carlo analysis. By the third question, Vivian was visibly sweating. The kind of perspiration that happens when your fight or flight response realizes flight isn't an option and fighting requires weapons you don't possess. That's when Raymond Kim looked directly at me and said, "I think we might benefit from some technical clarification on these methodologies. Would you mind joining us at the table?" Vivian's smile could have shattered steel, but she nodded enthusiastically as if inviting me forward had been her idea all along. "Of course," she said, her voice just slightly too loud. "Technical expertise is exactly why we have such a strong team." I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and began systematically answering every question the board had been asking. Questions about correlation coefficients, confidence intervals, simulation methodologies, risk attribution, and hedging effectiveness. I didn't just provide numbers, I provided context, explaining why these metrics mattered, how they inform decision-making, and what specific actions the company should take. Based on the analysis, the board members started taking notes. Patricia Wells asked 3 follow-up questions about option strategies. David Chen wanted clarification on scenario assumptions, and Raymond Kim requested a timeline for implementation recommendations. I answered everything clearly, thoroughly, demonstrating exactly the kind of practical application of theoretical knowledge that Vivian had dismissed as academic fluff. When I finished, the presentation had effectively inverted. Vivian was now sitting in the back of the room, watching someone with just paper credentials provide exactly the kind of strategic insight and practical value creation that her street smarts had failed to deliver. Patricia Wells turned to Raymond Kim. "This level of analysis is exactly what we need for the regulatory review," she said. "The sophistication of the risk framework will demonstrate our commitment to best practices." David Chen nodded. "The quantitative approach gives us a significant competitive advantage, especially if we can integrate these insights into our trading strategies." Raymond Kim looked pleased. "This is excellent work," he said, looking directly at me. Then his gaze shifted to Vivian. "Vivian, I appreciate you coordinating this presentation, but moving forward, I think our risk analysis should be handled directly by our risk team. This makes sense from both an expertise and efficiency standpoint." Vivian's nod was the corporate equivalent of a death rattle after the meeting as board members filed out. Discussing implementation timelines and next steps, Vivian approached me with the kind of smile people wear to funerals. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice carefully controlled. We walked to her office in silence, the kind of silence that follows natural disasters and career implosions. She closed the door, sat behind her desk, and looked at me with what might have been respect if it weren't so clearly tinged with resentment. "That was well played," she said finally. I leaned back in my chair, matching her tone. "I'm not sure what you mean. I was just providing the technical support you requested for the board presentation." She laughed once, short and bitter. "You systematically demonstrated that I don't understand the fundamentals of risk management in front of the entire board." "You made me look incompetent." I raised an eyebrow. "You made yourself look incompetent. I just answered their questions accurately. The difference between us, Vivian, is that my paper credentials actually represent knowledge. Your street smarts represent politics. And today the board needed knowledge, not politics." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "What do you want?" I could have been gracious. I could have offered to work collaboratively going forward. I could have suggested we focus on our respective strengths. Instead, I leaned forward and said, "What I want is for you to remember this conversation the next time you're tempted to dismiss someone's education as just paper. because paper credentials backed by actual knowledge just restructured the power dynamic in this company, and you're now reporting your risk management responsibilities to someone whose only real-world experience comes from Wharton Business School. Vivian's face went through that familiar color progression, but this time it settled on something closer to resignation than rage over the next month. The organizational chart quietly rearranged itself. Risk management was moved out of operations and into a new strategic analytics division reporting directly to the CEO. My title changed to Director of Risk Management and Quantitative Analysis. My salary increased by 40%, and my office moved to the executive floor with windows that looked out over the city instead of the parking garage. Vivian remained as coup, but her responsibilities now focused on traditional operational management facilities, human resources, administrative functions, the areas where her experience actually provided value. She no longer oversees strategic analysis, risk assessment, or financial modeling. Those functions belong to people whose paper credentials represent actual expertise. The beautiful irony is that Vivian was right about one thing. Education and experience are different. But she made the mistake of thinking that made education worthless, when actually it made her experience incomplete. My MBA wasn't just paper. It was a foundation for understanding systems, thinking, quantitative analysis, and strategic frameworks that street smarts alone can't provide. Her 20 years of experience gave her operational knowledge. My graduate education gave me the tools to optimize, analyze, and improve those operations. The combination made me more valuable than either credential alone, and that's what she never understood. 3 months after the organizational restructuring, I was invited to speak at the Regional Risk Management Conference, the same conference where Vivian had been a panelist the previous year discussing operational excellence in financial services. This year, she was in the audience taking notes while I presented on advanced quantitative risk modeling and its practical applications. The irony was so thick you could have used it as collateral for a derivatives trade. My presentation was titled From Theory to Practice: Implementing Sophisticated Risk Analytics in Traditional Financial Institutions. And yes, I absolutely chose that title on purpose. The audience was full of executives like Vivian, people who'd built careers on experience and intuition, now scrambling to understand why quantitative analysis was becoming essential for survival in increasingly complex markets during the Q&A session. One participant asked how organizations could bridge the gap between traditional operational management and modern analytical requirements. I looked directly at Vivian in the third row and said, "The key is recognizing that experience and education aren't competing assets. They're complementary tools, but organizations that dismiss analytical capabilities as merely academic are essentially choosing to navigate modern markets with 19th century instruments. It's not just inefficient, it's strategically dangerous." The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly the entire audience was applauding. Not just politely, but with the enthusiasm of people who'd finally heard someone articulate what they'd been struggling to understand. Vivian clapped too slowly at first, then with what looked like genuine appreciation. After the presentation, she approached me at the networking reception. "Congratulations," she said. And for the first time since I'd known her, the compliment sounded sincere. That was brilliant, and more importantly, it was useful. I nodded. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from someone with your operational experience?" She smiled. The kind of smile that suggested she'd learned something about the difference between being threatened by expertise and being enhanced by it. 6 months later, Meridian Financial won an industry award for risk management innovation. The citation specifically mentioned our sophisticated analytical frameworks and quantitative methodologies as setting new standards for the sector. Raymond Kim accepted the award, but in his remarks, he specifically credited the collaboration between operational experience and analytical sophistication as the key to our success. Vivian was promoted to Executive Vice President of Operations, a role that focused entirely on her actual strengths, while I became Senior Vice President of Risk and Strategic Analytics with a team of 6 analysts and a budget that would have made my business school professors weep with pride. The beautiful irony is that Vivian was right about one thing. Education and experience are different. But she made the mistake of thinking that made education worthless, when actually it made her experience incomplete. My MBA wasn't just paper. It was a foundation for understanding systems thinking, quantitative analysis, and strategic frameworks that street smarts alone can't provide. Her 20 years of experience gave her operational knowledge. My graduate education gave me the tools to optimize, analyze, and improve those operations. The combination made me more valuable than either credential alone, and that's what she never understood. But here's what she did eventually learn. Dismissing someone's credentials as just paper doesn't make them less qualified. It just makes you look more threatened. And in a world where data drives decisions and analytics determine outcomes, being threatened by education isn't street smart, it's career suicide. Thanks for watching, you Cubicle Warriors. And if this story of academic revenge resonated with your own workplace battles, then hit that subscribe button, because we're building an army of people who know the difference between real expertise and corporate politics.